Welcome to our third webinar, uh, aptly titled BD and 3D, Data, Demand, and Differentiation. So using data to create demand around differentiation. So our third webinar will deal with those 3Ds. So I'm pleased today to be joined by Rob Alston, our Senior Director of Sales, and by both for Rob and I, a longtime friend of ours and stalwart in this industry, Eric Fletcher. And Eric, for those of you who may not know, has been involved in marketing and business development for national and global accounting, consulting, law firms, other professional service firms for more than 30 years. He's been the strategic architect of successful pursuits of as much as $400 million. Today he consults with a lot of professional firm management and C-suite leadership individuals in professional service firms that are seeking go-to-market strategies that fuel both market and revenue growth. He is one of the top influencers in our business on Twitter. His marketing brain fodder blog is required reading, in my opinion, and he is also a former TEDx speaker as well. So a incredibly impressive resume that Rob and I together can't even come close to approaching. So of course, we've invited Eric on to kind of walk through everything with us today and lend his expertise. So Eric, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you guys.
This is great. And Rob, welcome to you as well.
Yeah, I noticed my really long intro there, Patrick, so I appreciate it.
Well, yours and our, I think our intro, there was a little asterisk next to it on the PowerPoint slide that just said, pales in comparison to guests, do not mention. So it was, we simply just kind of glossed over ours. Guys, today, one of the things that we thought we would talk about is both the internal and external business development. I think, we've all done so many of these. Eric and Rob and myself, both collectively and individually, we've done some of these together over the years. And we always seem to come back to talking about, well, how can we use this to help the lawyers develop more business? And how can we use this product or this service or this data set to help the firms develop more? And we're going to talk about some of that today. There's extreme merit into that, but I think one of the things that increasingly is becoming much more critical is how can individuals, whether you're in practice development, in the library, in marketing and business development, how can the business professionals, or even legal ops for that matter, right, inside legal departments, how can the business professionals utilize this data to also effectively sell and position initiatives internally? And so that's one of the things that we want to talk about. And the other part of it too is we keep coming back to this around differentiation. And we've all, Eric and Rob and I, we've heard this for years. It's like, well, we've got to, we're going to be different. We've got to establish differentiation. And the one thing I will always come back to is it's not just about being different. The firms that can get ahead, the firms that can move forward, they've understood how to create demand around that differentiation. So you just don't have to be different, but you've got to be able to create demand around it. You've got to make it compelling, and you've got to have some type of action facilitated by it. So, I think that's going to frame the talking points for today. Eric, Rob, anything else to add before we start on this?
No, I think
perfect frame.
Tee up.
So, all right. Well, thanks, guys. So, Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I too appreciate this topic. I think that there's a lot here to discuss. There's a lot we're doing in legal intelligence sort of aimed at how we help these law firms become more differentiated. And, in a crowded market where we have quite a bit of continuous competitiveness, even with all the consolidation that we've seen, this differentiation is really something that's important. I know, Eric, gosh, we've worked together now time flies, but I think I started talking to you probably about 6-7 years ago as a client, but I soon learned that you not only had a great mind for marketing, branding, communications, but you really were passionate about business development. So I know we have someone who's great to talk to about this topic. The first question I ask is, Patrick was quite right. A lot of the emphasis sometimes is on the external, like how are you talking to clients, how are you positioning? But another key component of BD that's really important is sort of building that internal BD and that ability to build the business case. I know John Cotter, leader, author of About Leading Change, is called it the guiding coalition. I know that's something you are familiar with and working with the law firms that you have, but really professional services over your career. What are some ways that you've been able to develop a guiding coalition and create that buy-in?
I love this topic because you do have to sell internally before, especially inside a law firm, before we can move outside very effectively. And like to use Cotter's terminology, that the coalition is our first target audience, right? As marketers trying to move the business development ball internally, I think that coalition is, how do I connect with that target? So I always start with what I believe is the reality that in most law firm environments, business development, the basic perspective that's required for business development is kind of, it's foreign to the law firm space in many ways, and especially foreign to firms, to lawyers that are my age, over 50 and on up, because we didn't have to be terribly proactive, terribly intentional about a go-to-market strategy 2, 3, 4 decades ago. These days, it's a different ballgame. So you start with the idea that business development's a bit of an anathema, and try to, what do I do to connect with the people that I need to move to develop this coalition? And this is where it's tough for those of us that come at this originally from a marketing perspective oftentimes, because we want to talk about, we want to move in with the art. We want to approach it from a communication standpoint, the art of communication. And in many instances, that's just a tough place to begin with lawyers. The marketing lingo, everything that goes with it, even as we finesse it and move it towards more business development and sales language, that even becomes more difficult to connect with lawyers. So I think about, this is where science, as opposed to art, can really be helpful to us. And how can we, the question then is, how can we use data, science, black and white content to help connect with the law firm leaders, to help broaden? I'm really looking in that coalition. I want early adopters, because again, we're talking about something that in many respects is foreign. So that's the short answer, long-winded way to get to the short answer, Rob, is this is where I rely more on science than I do on art, and hence the focus on data.
That's great. And, it was interesting, I think Cotter has an 8-step, but one of them was to try to get to that 75% at some point to move change within an organization. And in this case, we're talking mostly about law firms, but, you talked about getting key leaders involved and having the ability to start to mobilize them for where that change might occur. How do you approach using data in those conversations with those folks to help try to make that something that helps mobilize perhaps that change?
Well, full disclosure, I'm not sure I've ever done it terribly effectively. It doesn't feel like it sometimes, but so I think, again, back to basic sales or basic business development. How do you connect with an audience and move them? What I'm looking for much of the time, apart from kind of communications 101, where do we share some common ground? Theoretically, inside the firm, what we share is the desire to grow the pie, right? The desire to increase the bottom line. So I began to look at where are their challenges with respect to that? Where are their problems with respect to that? It's exactly what we suggest that we do in an external sales mode. I'm looking for problems. I'm looking for gaps. I'm looking for places where I can help suggest a solution. So one of the places I go, Rob, is most law firms have. There are exceptions to the rule, of course. So I'm going to say most law firms a dozen times today, and the caveat has to be there are tons of exceptions to the rule. But many law firms struggle with what I kind of I use this label of anemic organic growth. We typically grow by adding inventory, by adding bodies, by adding hours that we can bill or lawyers that we can put on matters. That's how we grow, acquiring laterals, acquiring groups, doing acquisitions and mergers. So the challenge, the place I try to connect is to demonstrate the opportunity around, the economic opportunity around growing by way of adding work before you add overhead, before you add bodies, before you engage in a merger or acquisition strictly for growth purposes. If that's connecting, that's kind of the need is organic growth. How do we grow internally? How do we grow without going outside of ourselves and adding hours or adding inventory? And the way we do that is by creating the demand for the work. Now that may lead to a growth in numbers of lawyers, and oftentimes it does. But as opposed to saying I'm going to grow by adding people, I want to grow by getting the work, and that's that's where I try to pitch conversation. Again, sometimes effectively and sometimes not. And maybe the way I just explained it explains why sometimes I'm not effective, right?
No. Hey, I think that if you can grow with what you've got rather than having to invest, then I think that would speak to a lot of people. But when you have data behind some things that can help folks understand how they can achieve it, that also can help. So, no, that makes sense to me, Eric. One of the things too, and we've talked a lot about this over the years. There is a lot of focus externally. There's a lot of focus on client intelligence. Of course, you got to understand your client. You need to have good analysis and intel on that. We do provide that at ALM Intelligence as well. But another thing we've been finding is sort of a trend is that, going to the heart of this differentiation is that lawyers are just extremely competitive as well. And so, the idea is how can you get pure competitive intelligence that can help the lawyers understand how they are better, or more importantly, in some cases, maybe where they have gaps and they're not as good potentially as the competition in certain areas. And then, how can you use that? How can that be used more effectively internally?
Yeah, so I'll come at it from the back half of your question first, and as opposed, there's a number of head-to-head kinds of conversations that can really be energizing and compelling, and definitely show differentiation. But one of the best examples of a business development conversation that assumes it assumes a level of professional competency kind of across the board. And in many respects, this is where clients are today in vast segments of the marketplace. They assume if they're calling 20 mid-size or 20 AmLaw 50 firms, they assume in either of those cases that competency is a given, right? Excellent work is kind of a given. So with that assumption going in, a conversation that focuses on a metric that has nothing to do with subject matter expertise can become the issue that differentiates. And a great example of this is the conversations around diversity today. Who's done an RFP in the last 5 years or 10 years that hasn't had diversity as a major component of it, and it grows. So every day there are clients are using data that is not necessarily connected to work product, but has to do with diversity or gender or ethnicity to help them make hiring decisions with respect to advisors. Firms that have management that they've managed to carve out a way to have, for example, more women in management than on average than the typical firm. If you don't use that as a conversation point, as a differentiator, then you're passing up an opportunity. And then, of course, there are head-to-head conversations where data is available, and if you're not using the data to compare your win-loss ratio when it's advantageous, then you're clearly missing a big opportunity. From win-loss ratio to how long it takes to solve a matter to how you staff, how you're able to staff matters more efficiently and effectively. Those are all discussions around how the kinds of data that I would use, Rob.
That's great. Well, hey, I am going to continue the conversation, and I'm going to be asking you some more questions about some of those types of differentiation in data that we've been talking about. By taking everyone into Legal Compass, showing a few things that we are able to do to really compare and contrast, and then draw those areas of differentiation, which can be difficult sometimes in the law firm market. Okay? So first things first, let me just get out of here for 1 second and bring up, this is Legal Compass for those who haven't seen it before, and it is a leading firm enterprise business of law solution. It brings a lot of information on law firms, on lawyers, on the clients they serve. Today, obviously, we could go a lot of places. It is certainly recognized for all these type of applications. It's a Digital Folio award-winning solution this year, based on a lot of factors, but really its ease of use as well. One of the things I wanted to do along the lines of the conversation we've been having here with Eric is about differentiation and how we can compare and contrast. Legal Compass does a great job of giving you tools and insight to be able to do just that. Right here, you'll see we have a pretty large number of law firms, and we can search across geographies globally. We can also search more and more, and this is more of a critical, important element, is you can benchmark across the size of the firm based on ranking or based on headcount, based on financials, and then, as Eric was just talking about, also based on even some diversity standards we might want to look for. Number of offices. So a lot of different ways that we can look at law firms, compare them. Certainly also, a lot of law firms know the firms they like to compare against, and many of their lawyers will tell you which ones those are. And using Legal Compass, you can easily set lists of firms that you like to track, and I've got several of my own here. But I just created sort of a random list just for this demonstration purpose, and I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. And what it's going to do is actually bring up 5 firms. You know, you probably recognize these firms. They have strong national presence, but are very strong in their respective regional areas as well, where they're headquartered. And what I'm going to do is just go ahead and select each one of these firms, and you'll see it allows me to bring them in. And for the sake of time, I'm actually going to go ahead and just click on the compare button here. And it's going to bring this up. And then what I can show you very quickly is the type of results that you would be able to get out of a search like that. Now, the advantage is that I can use this to basically look across the financials, across the revenue and profits, firm size, which also includes staffing, and then some of the diversity rankings as well across all of our firms. So what I can then do too is I can just extract and export that data and take a look at more of the things that I want to compare about. Now, this is just this last year, but Legal Compass, given our proprietary data in many of our surveys going back as far as 30 years, can really allow you to look at trends over time and some things you could have seen about where the firms have been that are driving them where they are today across a lot of these different key performance indicators. As I mentioned, these firms, a little bit random, but as you look at them, you can see some different things. You know, Eric, bringing you back in for a second, we were talking yesterday, I think when we were looking at this comparison, and we were discussing some things, and on the far right here, we have Polsinelli here. And what's interesting is their number of, they're hiring for their female partners. And given how differentiated that looked against some of the other law firms here, and I'm wondering, you know, what are your thoughts about what advantages or positioning or thoughts you have about how you might be looking to help share that when you were able to identify this type of information?
Sure. And Rob, the disclaimer here is we prepared a little bit, but I haven't dug into the data and looked at the underlying realities of it. But using the female recruiting or hiring number as an indicator, if I'm in a market, for example, that has where we have a strong contingent of women partners or leadership in the firm or across the firm, and I've used that as a differentiator, and we have, for example, a number of say women-owned clients or clients where we know one of the factors in their choosing us has been our differentiation with respect to women. And I know Polsinelli is in my market. I'm keeping an eye on that. And I'm certainly taking it to our management team, to the people that are working on strategy on a daily basis, because these guys are moving into the market. They're infringing on one of the things that we have always prided ourselves in as being a differentiator. We're about to lose that differentiation potentially. So that's just that. I've obviously extrapolated a lot that I don't know there, Rob, but that's the kind of that's the way I begin to look at some of the data.
You know, hey, this is Patrick. A couple of things on this that, you know, Eric, to your point, you know, we can look at this a variety of different ways. And a couple of things I want to point out. I mean, all these firms here have really strong numbers, right? So this isn't, you know, a situation where we're comparing against, you know, any one firm and saying, you know, look how this firm is better than the other. All these firms have really strong numbers, which is part of the reason why when we were putting this together, we selected this. But it also, I think, really illustrated the way that we can use the information differently, right? So, you know, Rob, right now you're highlighting, you know, Polsinelli, and, you know, they've got 105 female partners. And that's a really strong number, and it's something that you want to be able to lead with. At the same time, I know that, you know, internally, if I'm, you know, pitching, you know, the fact that we're going to take this approach for here. So one of the things that we might want to highlight is not the fact is we're never going to compete, for example, on the number of female partners we have at, you know, for a couple of these firms, like with Ballard Spahr. We just don't have the sheer numbers to be able to compete from a volume perspective, but we can do it from a percentage perspective, right? And so, and it's not something that we would necessarily go in and say, here's where we're better than everybody else, but it's a way of presenting it that you're creating demand around, which, for any one of these firms, the pitch is kind of simple, right? Is, hey, one of the things that we take great pride in, et cetera, is, the ability to develop and retain female talent. And, so much so that a strong percentage of our partnership, nearly 40% of our partnership is female. And this translates into, X, Y, and Z. And so there's a lot that you can utilize this for to position your firm effectively without, Eric, as you pointed out, right, necessarily pushing back on competition, right? You want to kiss the competitors, but you want to create differentiation for yourself in a way that causes buyers who ask your competitors, well, are you doing this, or can you do this, or are you staffed the same way? And the same thing goes with some of the other numbers that are on here. We focused on diversity, but I think it's important as well because you start looking at other data points, right? So what's the cost per lawyer and what's their profit per lawyer? So in other words, with certain firms, is there a way for us to look at their leverage and their profit per lawyer, be able to say, you know what, we might be able to execute this given our structure with a fee arrangement or a pricing engagement that allows us to create differentiation through how we approach the matter, right? How we deliver the legal services, how we staff the legal services, the consistency and predictability of the pricing engagement. So this is, as you guys have pointed out, really getting into the raw aspect of competitive intelligence to be able to understand what our competitors are doing, how they're staffed. And there's a lot more data, Rob, as you pointed out, there's a lot more data that we can continue to add into this. But I'll point out one final time, all these firms, they're strong, they're, high in they're A-list ranked firms, very, very good firms. We just wanted to be able to show the different types of the data in through here. And there's a lot more, Rob, that I know we could add to this and really expand out upon how we can create levels of differentiation using this. And this is more, by the way, for internal sales and guiding the approach that we want to take from a pitch perspective.
Patrick, to your point, going back to the female numbers, for example, the point that a mid-sized firm is not going to be able to compete with 105 female partners, that there's not any way. But you mentioned percentage of partnership as women. Percentage, the conversation might focus on, look, our 10 or 15% of our partnership is women who are in leadership roles in the firm, which means our view of strategy, our view of serving, our view of client service, our view that is shaped by the female perspective, where that's a valuable differentiator. So yeah, it's not a matter of one is better than the other. It's a matter of how can you define differentiation.
Yeah, Eric, you're nailing it. I think that this comes back to something you talk about quite a bit, is how can we change the conversation? And part of what we always want to be in a directing role in a business development situation. We don't want to be back on our heels, right? We want to be the leading that conversation, but we also want to make sure that we're directing it in a manner that is beneficial to us, right? So we want to control the context of the conversation. You've written on your blog quite a bit about changing the conversation, whether it's from the management side or the BD side. And this, to me, informs us, because it's almost a little bit of behavioral economic type of nudging somebody into the direction. It's like, look at the data, look at the numbers. Now let's see how we would approach positioning our firm, knowing what we know about the other firms that are likely to be competing or are currently serving the client, and knowing what's important to the client.
Yeah, it's awfully easy, especially in our industry, in the legal space, to just assume this is the shape the conversation will take. Conversation is going to take shape around number of partners in X practice area, or how deep is our bench across this industry. But that might not be the way to frame the conversation. There may be, and until you dig into the data, you're not necessarily aware of all the ways, all the possibilities for changing the conversation to your advantage, to highlight differentiation.
Great conversation, guys. I'm actually, now that we've kind of hit a certain area where we've been talking about comparing firms, maybe it's a group of firms that we want to compare, maybe they meet a certain criteria, maybe they're part of the RFP. I think what we is certainly some ways that you can go in and try to find where there might be some different differentiation points once discussed with a client. Certainly the opportunity to find some impact positioning there. One of the things too that I wanted to discuss on much like lawyers do a good job of issue spotting, one of the things we have to do within good BD is issue spot for differentiation, right, Eric? You have to find out where those opportunities may be in order to actually be able to know that and then make that part of the conversation. Here's one of the areas I want to do and talk a little bit more about and get your view as well, Eric and Patrick, is we're able to find those differentiation areas in benchmarks. So I'm just going to go in benchmarking, which is a tool that takes a lot of this information that we have and allows for a great deal of analysis around it. So first, in a firm here, I think many folks are probably familiar with Lewis Brisbois. What I'm going to do is actually go in here and actually compare them against the broader audience of the AmLaw 200, which is another great facet of what we're able to do with Legal Compass. So sometimes it's great to be able to compare against specific law firms, which we do pretty uniquely well, but it's also to see how is their differentiation against the pack. And so that's something we're able to do. And so if I just quickly click on this, what it's able to do is bring this up. And it takes just a second to bring that up. So while it is, I'll show you that. And then here is that comparison. So it gives you a nice little scorecard. And so now we can tell if there is some differentiation against the AmLaw 200 for Lewis. A little bit on the revenue per lawyer and cost per lawyer as well as profit are a little bit down. But we do see some opportunity here with leverage. So in this area right here, that's pretty substantial difference that we're looking at with a 6.62 variance from the market. And you can see how high Lewis is over the median. So then we look down a little bit further too. We're able to look at some things and see some pretty good variance here when it comes to percentage of minority attorneys, percentage of female attorneys. These may be some opportunities. So I'll stop for just a second and would love to get you guys' thoughts on, the potential when looking at something like this, like how you might think about the positioning going in on a particular opportunity, or thinking about this and how that internal selling might occur, just to make folks aware this may be an opportunity in some positioning for this firm. And I'll start with you, Patrick. He's still there.
I muted myself, I mute myself, and most people really prefer me talking when I'm on mute, which is weird. I haven't quite figured that out yet. Rob, it's interesting within this when you look at it, because there's a couple of things that jump out. So if I'm looking at this from a competitive perspective, like we know we're up against Lewis Brisbois for something, and again, this is another very good firm, but there's a couple of things that jump out at me. One is when I start looking at this, the revenue per lawyer is fairly low. The other part, though, is that they have, as you pointed out, they have insane leverage. Their leverage is great, right? And but they also have the profit margins much lower. So what that tells me is that they're doing a lot of their business development, a lot of their work is being done on price, on lower costs, right? So we're not going to win, and we can't win. We can't get into that game with firms that are able to execute against that strategy. We can't get into that game. So we know that that's not going to be something that we're going to be able to go in. So for me, this goes back, Eric, to the conversations we've had about changing the conversation. It's also, we realize through this is pure competitive intelligence, we're not going to win on price. We have got to change the conversation and direct it to something other than price as a part of this, because we're just not going to win that part of the battle.
I muted myself too. I'm right there with you in terms of being able to appreciate it, people appreciating that. Yeah, so there's two or three things in terms of the internal conversation, the selling internally, and positioning yourself as a business development executive. One of them is sometimes it just makes sense to say no, right? You just got to know when this is one that it is not. This is an opportunity that's not an opportunity for us. Great opportunity for a firm that's positioned differently, but it's not going to be one. So knowing when to say no, and there's really only one good way to know that, and that's with the data. The second thing that comes to mind here is if you do believe you can compete, if you do believe this, you have a profitable, winning approach to the particular issue that's being discussed, whether it's a matter case, whatever it is, then you've got to use the data to, as Patrick's alluded a couple of times, to change the conversation. So the conversation, as opposed, they may have incredible leverage, but here's what we know about what that leverage means, and the context, the conversation for us needs to be around the value that every hour that we bring to the table, or whatever the appropriate metric is, the value of that metric is much, maybe that's where we differentiate. So we wrap up matters in a shorter period of time with a smaller staff, and at the end of the day, the leverage looks great for one firm, but the bottom line looks better for another firm. So the data can help you know what opportunities it's right to chase, and it can help you identify the differentiation. Those are the two things that I take away from this kind of slide.
That's great. Yeah, so definitely.
Rob, can you go to the charts on this as well too? Can you click over to that? Sorry, while you're talking.
So I simply click here, and it's bringing up search, and you can see that differentiation comes to life in the charts a lot more when we start talking about the leverage against the AmLaw and the global standards. Also, you can see that a little more too when we're talking about where we can see, well, the firm is actually doing on the female attorney basis compared to Global 200. Any thoughts about that?
Well, what's interesting about this is it enables, this is where we can look at this information, this is, a couple of things here. We can look at it, one, from the competitive intelligence perspective, right? Which is, hey, what can we learn about our competitors? What can we learn about our rivals? And how can we utilize that to shape the direction that we want to go, as we've all been talking about. The other part, though, is if I'm at Lewis Brisbois, the question becomes is, hey, is this something that I can take when I walk in and I really want to be able to demonstrate and create a visual component, right? So, one of the things that, going back to John Cotter, who we're all huge fans of Cotter, one of the things that Cotter really talks about in a lot of his change books and in leading change is connecting the head with the heart, and something Eric's unfortunately heard this repeatedly over the years, but, people tend to buy emotionally and justify logically, right? And we see that all the time. Lawyers are a little bit different, right? And so are scientists and accountants and everything else. They tend to be more logical up front and then emotional once they connect the logic pieces to it. So part of what we want to be able to use the visual component for on this is when we're with the client to be able to say, here's how we compare to everybody else. When we talk about the fact that we're different, we are different, and here's why. And, so Rob, I think that this is a great, example right here. You've got the staffing and partnership model brought up, and we can do that on the scatter plot as well too, to really be able to get into how much do we stand out from the peers. And so that becomes a really interesting, there's a scatter plot. This is a really interesting way of saying, we are different from everybody else. And, so putting this onto a screen, because you can download these and utilize them, as part of the pitch or as the materials that are being used to really isolate the fact we're different from everybody else. And this, Rob, I think when you did this, you were looking at leverage versus cost per lawyer, right? And how that translates. So, from a buyer of legal services who is looking for predictability, cost predictability, and certainty. One of the things that we always would work with legal departments on is, here are the markers of firms that can do certain things better than others in some cases. And so one of the things that I would always look at was the leverage, right? So if they had really strong leverage like Lewis Brisbois does that then translate, because it didn't always do it, but does it translate into their ability to put together fixed fee arrangements or lower cost rate structures and then do fee caps or things like that could give some level of cost predictability or certainty? This is a great way of demonstrating how much, at Lewis Brisbois, how different they are than everybody else.
Yeah, and the great thing that a lot of clients have commented to me about with Legal Compass is, because we can track these variables across, the key financials, but also a lot of these diversity metrics that we've been talking about has become another area, has become more important to the corporate client. So law firms are certainly paying attention to that as well. And so it's really interesting because the other thing that we did with this firm is we sort of looked at that since we saw in the charts, right, some real diversity differentiation there. And so this is sort of a pre-search of the same firm with growth in female partners as the first variable and then maintaining leverage as the other. But once again, we see Lewis really on the outlier status with that, and understanding that and being able to position that for opportunity where that is impactful for the client in the conversation is something that really the lawyer should know about. And if you're using data to create that opportunity to understand your differentiation, then your positioning based on the client need. I think that's really where we're getting at with what Eric's been describing in terms of his process with a lot of his successes over his career as well. Hey, I only had a couple minutes left, and it's been a great conversation. We wanted to show you how you can use competitive intelligence data, not only to compare and contrast firms, but actually identify those gaps and those differentiation points, maybe in some areas you didn't expect to find them. But having a tool like Legal Compass, we believe you're well armed for a lot of that kind of insight and analysis. I did have one question I wanted to address that I got from the audience related to where does the data come from? Well, it comes from ALM. ALM, as I mentioned, has been working on getting this data from the market via our really renowned best of breed surveys in the market. The AmLaw 100, 200, our NLJ 500, our Global 100, now 200, that has just come out concurrently. So a lot of this financial staffing data that you asked the question about, that's where that comes from. And, of course, we're keeping that in the archive, too, so that you're able to really look at the trends over time and measure these kind of variables that we've been sharing with you today. Okay? Hey, for last-minute wrap-up, any final thoughts? Again, Eric, really appreciate your time, and any time I get to socialize and you, it's a privilege. You have any final thoughts in closing?
No, this has been fun. I love the tool, and thank you guys for your kind words and the opportunity.
And Patrick, any
No, this has been great. And we scheduled this one a little bit longer. We knew that we would get into great conversation. We still, Rob, we never touched on the lateral, information and utilizing the laterals in the same purpose, which we'll need to do in a subsequent webinar. So, Eric, we are going to invite you back to talk about that, because it becomes there's a really interesting part of the CI is also looking at turnover amongst your competitors and shaping how that might or their additions, right, and where they're growing or maybe where they're turning people over. So we'll cover that in a subsequent webinar. In fact, there's a slide that we've got pulled up here. You can, there's a lot there that if we're looking at that going, hey, we're going into this pitch and look at the amount of turnover in certain key areas. This becomes, there's a lot of ways that we could probably spend a half hour talking about different ways that Eric, that we would use this to drive the strategy forward. So I think what we'll do, just in the interest of time for everybody, we'll schedule a subsequent one here in a couple of weeks. And Eric, if you're interested, love to have you back, and we can dive into that.
Absolutely. Yeah, this slide ought to be a part of every strategy meeting that's going on right now. As people next year.
Yeah, I tend to agree for a variety of reasons, because there's so much that's there that will impact the approach that we take, how we, the questions that we ask. There's a lot that's there just from one slide on turnover with a competitor.
Yep. Yeah, it's great. We pointed out here in a quick discussion yesterday that Kirkland Ellison, this particular firm, which we did keep them anonymous, but we were showing that they had 7 partners actually had departed this scorecards from the last 2 years. And we had a really interesting conversation where Eric knew that certain law firms were moving into your market practice areas. Understanding that with current insight was really helpful. And so certainly there are some opportunities within how we can do that with Legal Compass and track that for our clients. It really is useful. So sorry we did run tight on time. Sorry that this sort of is something that we'll hope to spend more time on, but it is really important, as lawyers are certainly the product in legal services, and it's one that has become a big part of the strategy for a lot of our law firms in executing. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. Eric, thanks again. I really appreciate it. It's been great to speak with you. Patrick, thanks for your insight as usual and expertise. And folks, just in wrapping, if there's anybody who has some interest in learning more about Legal Compass, maybe for some specific unique needs you have, either at your law firm or even more and more legal providers are using us as well, we'd love to have a conversation with you from our team. So see if we can serve you. Thanks again, everybody, for joining. We appreciate it. Hope you have a great rest of the afternoon. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye now.